Hello and greetings to all of you who are joining this webinar titled Trends in Intra-State and Transnational Security, Asia-Pacific 2021. This is the first of two webinars today organized by the Asia-Pacific team of the Defense and Security Foresight Group under the auspices of the MINDS network. I'm Brian Jobe, professor at UBC, and will be the moderator for today's session. And I begin by acknowledging that UBC's Point Grey campus in Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Others of you will be joining from the territorial homes of many other Aboriginal nations, which we join in acknowledging as well. By way of introduction, our first webinar earlier today focused on what is usually referred to as traditional Asia-Pacific crisis points and the major power politics surrounding them. This session, the second one, looks to the well-being and security of Asian populations whose lives are most directly and immediately affected by the so-called non-traditional security concerns. In other words, many more people are affected by the issues that we're talking about, that our participants will share their expertise about, for instance, the impacts of the global pandemic, migration and refugee movements, transnational violence, civil resistance to the state, and environmental disasters across a broad geographic scope. Our participants have experience in various areas of Asia. We got the privilege today of having four expert panelists to inform and focus our discussion. I have to say at the outset that Yvonne Su, who was originally scheduled to participate, had to withdraw because of a family concern. Nothing serious, but certainly took her away from this morning. Each of our four then expert panelists have more time perhaps than was initially scheduled, but let's target about 10 minutes each. And after that, we'll move to a give and take 30-minute or so Q&A session. I'll draw upon questions posted by participants in the Q&A section and ask you to note the Q&A function on your screen, and the questions will come up on the right-hand side. With that, noting that the session is being recorded, turn to the first of our presenters, and this is Sarah. Sarah Sharma is a PhD student in the political science department at Queen's University. She is the holder of a prestigious Vanier Scholarship. Sarah is interested in global governance and development, political ecology, urban politics. Her recent fieldwork seeks to understand the unique position that cities are in when adapting to climate change. And she focuses upon two diverse locales, one being Amsterdam in the Netherlands and the other Dhaka in Bangladesh. Sarah previously served as an economics affairs consultant with UNCTAD, and she's told us this morning that she successfully defended her PhD, and that's wonderful. Congratulations to you. So Sarah, the floor is yours. I think you need to unmute.
Isn't this always the way? You know, you think you get better at this, but you don't. So thank you so much for having me here today, and I'm really happy to talk about, to perhaps set the stage and prime some of these other discussions that we're going to be having on security issues in the Asia-Pacific region. So first things first, I would like to denote the breadth and scope of climate considerations, environmental issues in Asia that are really perhaps location dependent. As we know, the Asia-Pacific region is quite a large and geographically diverse area of the world, holding about 60% of the world's population. So when I'm speaking to climate change, and specifically the area of my research in Bangladesh in South Asia, I don't want to overstate the regional applicability of my findings of my work. So, but I will say when we're thinking about climate change in Asia, there is this huge perhaps difference in rural and urban situations, and particularly rural livelihoods are being increasingly threatened by climate change, in particular agricultural livelihoods. This is in part due to in coastal regions because of rising sea levels, salinity in the soil, but in maybe perhaps more inland areas because of things like droughts, and then maybe on the other hand, too much rain, so floods. So what we're seeing is this increasing encroachment of climate and environmental hazards in the day-to-day lives of rural agricultural workers, and also increased volatility of the environment, which makes it very difficult, I think, in terms to plan and adapt what you're doing. And then in the urban centers in particular, similarly, flooding is a huge issue. Also, heat is a huge issue, and having these urban heat island effects in which cities are increasingly becoming warmer, and this is of course impacted by maybe more man-made environmental hazards such as pollution and air quality. So I think when we think about climate change and the impacts for security in Asia, something that we think about quite a bit is migration, which will be done, I think, in further detail. But what I would like to highlight here is that I think that there has been a lot of fear-mongering around maybe international and transnational migration, when really internal migration within Asian countries as well is a huge issue, and something that I think certainly is also a global challenge. Just because people are moving from rural to urban locales doesn't mean that this shouldn't be something that should be transnationally engaged upon by global governance institutions. In particular, I think that as urban development institutions continue to work in cities and in the regions that I work at in Dhaka, we're having now perhaps this conversation in which internal migrants are being increasingly labeled as, forms of as illegal migrants, even when they actually are legally migrating, from a rural to an urban location. And I think that what's happening is that these populations are becoming increasingly securitized as, threats to what's happening normally. So we're seeing that we're supposed to be having these normal operations in urban centers that are being threatened by migrants that are coming in and perhaps settling informally in areas that are perhaps more vulnerable to environmental hazards such as flooding, that of course are becoming further exacerbated by climate change. And I'd like to perhaps challenge this interpretation of this illegality of climate migrants, because what is happening is that if there's no policies or other ways in which to address livelihoods being impacted by climate change, then people need to leave, and they need to change things, and they need to do something to ameliorate their life circumstances. And so I think that is something, especially in Dhaka and in Bangladesh, where I do my research, is a huge problem. The second thing that I would like to touch on here is the ways in which climate change maps onto pre-existing security crises. Again, thinking about the Bangladeshi context, where there are just shy of 1 million Rohingya refugees, these groups are being resettled in increasingly precarious environmental regions. This summer, there was a range of floods in late July and August in Bangladesh that were extremely dangerous to the Rohingya population living primarily in Cox's Bazar, a coastal region of Bangladesh. And refugees passed away because of the flooding and the mudslides as a result of the floods in this area. And the problem can maintains is that there's not necessarily any movement of these groups. So we know that climate change is getting worse. We know that refugees are situated on extremely precarious environments, and there aren't necessarily large, I would say, interventions in this area to kind of protect the human security of these groups that are already in quite a precarious security situation. And the final thing that I'd like to touch on today before I pass on the torch here is that, climate change in the Asia Pacific, as it is in North America and Canada as well, is a class-based, a gendered, and a racialized issue. And individuals with more finances or more economic security, which tends to occur along gendered and race-based lines, have a stronger ability to make decisions in times of struggle and times of economic and environmental stress. So in the Asia Pacific, where we see quite a bit of vulnerability economically, this will continue to be an issue. And rather than perhaps espousing forms of individual resilience, what would be, in my opinion, a better way of approaching this from a security standpoint is to look at ways of ameliorating individuals' ability to be more secure in their environments and secure economically and at the household level to better be able to, adapt and weather increasing crises. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. You set the stage with painting a broad brush on some key issues. We might get back to you later on to have you say a bit more about your own research in the city context of Dhaka. But we move now to our next panelist. Isabelle Côté is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Memorial University of Newfoundland. And I apologize for not taking the Newfoundland time zone into account when I've announced all the times of these webinars. Isabelle's research investigates the role of internal population movements on intrastate conflict and contentious politics in East and Southeast Asia, very much an issue that Sarah has pointed us to already. In particular, Isabelle investigates the violent clashes between ethnically distinct native, that's in quotes, people and internal migrants in authoritarian China and newly democratizing Indonesia. Not sure that it still would be characterized as going in that direction, but the newly democratized in Indonesia. Isabelle is widely published in numerous journals, including the Canadian Journal of Political Science and Ethnopolitics. So thank you for joining us, Isabelle.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the Asia Pacific team from the Defense and Security Foresight Group for extending invitation all the way to your colleagues in Newfoundland. So to continue a little bit of the discussion we've had on the role of migration and security questions arising from population movement. Well, I'll start by stating the obvious, that the COVID pandemic has drastically affected population movements around the world. And just to cite one example, a study, as reported in a study that was conducted by the Pew Research Center, 142 countries that represented nearly 90% of the world's population had implemented a complete or partial border closure for foreign nationals. And by that, I mean tourists, of course, as well as business travelers or new immigrants as early as April 2020 in an effort to stop the spread of COVID-19. So example of this includes how China has closed its border fairly early on to almost everyone but a few diplomats and scientists. India did something similar as well, as it suspended visas, and Japan also. And in Japan, travelers who had traveled to countries where there were outbreaks of the coronavirus were forbidden from entering the country. But today, I'd like to bring our attention to the fact that there's been also a good number of domestic restrictions on internal movements that were implemented during the pandemic. And here I would ask Kirsty to kindly put a slide on. And such restrictions on internal movements including, for instance, the restrictions on interprovincial migrations in and out of Wuhan in China, as well as the very recently lifted lockdowns on city in Vietnam. And as you can see here on the map, on the interactive map on the screen, these two examples were not exceptions. They were in fact representative of something fairly common that took place in Asia, which was an increasing number of internal restrictions on population movement. So I encourage you to go see the interaction on this map. It's really neat. And I don't mean to say that this was unique to Asia, because as I'm sure many of you are aware, the government of my very province here in Newfoundland and Labrador did implement from July 2020 to July of 2021 a regulation that has made Canadian citizens, Canadian nationals who are not resident of Newfoundland and Labrador, to apply for a visa and, if granted, to quarantine for 2 weeks once they arrive in Newfoundland. Needless to say, this has ruffled some feathers, and so much so in fact that it has been, there's currently an appeal, even though this has since been dropped off since the summer. So I'm done with the map. You can take it off if you don't mind, Christy. Thank you. So what I want to spend the remainder of my time here is to discuss the consequences of those restrictions on internal mobility that have resulted from the COVID pandemic. And I especially want to pay attention to the impact it has had on contentious politics and on intrastate security issues. So internal mobility restrictions have come at a heavy cost for migrants, especially undocumented migrants, as they tend to be particularly vulnerable to social economic insecurities, such as forced eviction, food shortages, loss of income, and limited access to healthcare. For instance, studies have shown that migrant workers with a rural hukou who are employed in manufacturing and service sectors in China's urban areas have been particularly vulnerable during the outbreaks of COVID-19, when businesses were closed due to mobility restrictions. And a similar situation has also happened in India, when a 20-day lockdown implemented nationwide resulted in interprovincial migrants having to choose between essentially dying from hunger or dying from the virus. Another important aspect or another important impact of COVID-19 for migrant population, and here again, I'd like to clarify, I do speak about internal migrants, has been the increase in anti-migrant prejudice and stigma due to the fear of COVID transmission. So migrants who've returned to their hometowns and villages were seen often suspiciously by local people, even though they had tested negative for COVID and were following quarantine procedures as required. In India, for instance, fear of transmission of COVID-19 from outsiders resulted in many villages barricading their entry and exit points and prominently displaying posters saying, and I quote, "Outsiders not allowed." And here I found that particularly interesting because despite what was said on the posters, this particular example shows that it's not necessarily migrants' foreignness or outsiderness that was problematic, but the movement itself. It was the influx, or if you will, the exogenous shock to this community status quo that was seen as at risk and under threat. So it's important to mention that the examples that I just mentioned, that I just highlighted, depict form of contentions that emerge as a result from population movement from urban to rural areas. So it's the opposite of what Sarah depicted a little bit earlier. And so you had people leaving large cities in an effort to go to rural areas. So in such circumstances, those protestings were often, though of course not always, local rural people who fear that newcomers may bring the pandemic to their community, but also that their limited healthcare services would be overburdened by a large and rapid influx of people. But protests have also resulted as or have also emerged as a result of restrictions on domestic population movements. So violent protests have emerged in India, for instance, as migrant workers have asked for an end to the nationwide lockdown in order for them to be able to return home or obtain government assistance. And while lockdowns are oftentimes instituted by the central government, subnational actors have on occasion played a role in restricting access to their region. And again, here you can think of what Newfoundland did. So what pushes subnational actors and subnational units to call for and implement local regulation restricting the mobility of their fellow national citizens deemed a threat to local community, whether that threat is a health threat, an economic threat, or a cultural threat? It is that particular research agenda that I'm currently pursuing. So let me conclude very briefly by restating how policies meant to govern and restrict population movement, and especially those that are internal natures, do matter for contentious politics and for intrastate security. People who have until now been granted the right to settle and work almost anywhere within the confines of their country are suddenly seeing their options being limited, which has on occasion resulted in protest and violence. As states, both authoritarian but also democratics, as well as subnational, sub-state actors, have started flexing their muscle in that field and have started to implement an increasingly large number those restrictions. It is, I would argue, very important to keep an eye on these. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Isabelle. We'll come back to you. One issue, I think, being the manipulation of COVID restrictions in order to restrict political activity. And we'll come back to that. But we turn next to Nayang U. It's a privilege to have him join us. He's currently a visiting scholar in the Southeast Asia program at Cornell University. Nayang previously worked as a technical advisor for the governance program at the Asia Foundation in Myanmar. He's a resident fellow also at the Pacific Forum in Hawaii and a program manager at the Frederick Neumann Foundation for Freedom in Yangon. Nayang ran for Myanmar Parliament in the 2020 election from the People's Party, and in doing so, in service from 2016 to 2020, exposed several scandals of the National League for Democracy Government. Nayang is the founder and the host of Trends in Myanmar, which is a political talk show. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Nayang.
Thank you, Brian, for inviting me to do the panel. Thank you, my other panelists, for your great presentation. So I am going to discuss about the current situation in Myanmar since the coup. So there will be two parts in my presentation. One is about the current, the violent, the political crisis in Myanmar, what is happening in Myanmar right now. So that would be my first part of the presentation. And second part will be about what international community can do about the coup and how they can respond to the military regimes in power. So that will be my presentation. So as we all know that on February 1st, the military staged the coup in Myanmar. So they overthrew the elected civilian government. In fact, on February 1st was the day that the new parliament was scheduled to convene. So you will have the new parliament on February 1st. This parliament will elect the new government. That was the plan. But the military came into the power, and then they said that before the February, we have the election in 2010. So National League for Democracy, which is the Aung San Suu Kyi party, so they won landslide in the election. But military said that they found a massive electoral fraud in the election, so they have to came into the power and stage the coup. So you can see that Myanmar has been under the military regime since February, but within a few days, millions of people came out to the street and then they started protesting the military rule. But it was peaceful protest. people will sing the song, they will chant the slogan, they will organize their peaceful protests, no violence at all. That peaceful protests were going for a few weeks, but in late February, military started crashing down the protests. In February, in March, in April, you will see that military is using violence to control the protests across the country. So by May, I think by late May, people realized that peaceful protests were never end the military rule. So they started to think about changing, using another strategy, which is turning from the peaceful protests to the non-violent movement. So in April, we have the opposition government called National Unity Government, which is founded by the NAD and the other ethnic leaders. So right now you have the military council, the de facto government. You also have the opposition government set up by the other opposition groups. National Unity Government, they also have their political wings. It's called People Defense for PDF. So basically, you have NUG and the PDF. They are fighting against the military council in Myanmar. So student leaders and political activists and then protesters in March, in May, they started going to the jungle, to the border with the Thailand-Myanmar border, China-Myanmar border, where they will receive the military training from the ethnic rebellion school, and then they will come back and they started engaging in the urban warfare. Kasti, can you please show the map 2? I like to show the violence. This is just a Myanmar map. So this is where Myanmar is, and then can you show me the second map? Yeah, that one. So you can see that lately there are so many clash between the military council, Myanmar military, and also the BDF and other ethnic groups. So in the current crisis, there are three different players. One is all called the military. They are in the power, and the second group is the pro-democracy group, where you have the NUG opposition government and the BDF. They are military win, and also you have other student activists, other the labor organization, so on and so forth. But all of them has changed their strategy from non-violence protest to the violence. Now they are engaging in the violence. That is different from the Aung San Suu Kyi political philosophy. In the past 30 years, Aung San Suu Kyi believed in non-violence movement. She never encouraged the people to engage in the armed struggle, resistance movement. But right now she's in the jail, and then she's facing a lot of trials, so she cannot influence the current political movement. But people have already decided that the only way that can defeat the military is the violence, to engage in the civil war. So you have the military first player, pro-democracy people second player, and then finally you have the ethnic armed organization, ethnic rebellion group. Can you show me the last slide, please? The last map. Yeah, this is if you look at here, since before the good, Myanmar has the ongoing civil conflict. So some people said that this is the longest ongoing civil war in the world. If you look at them in the map, you can see that there are so many dozens of ethnic armed organizations. They have been fighting against the central government for autonomy in their own state, and also the federal system. So the first player military, second player NUG and the other pro-democracy movement, and then third player EAO, ethnic armed organization. Even in EAOs, you can divide into three groups. The first group is siding with the pro-democracy movement. So they will train the student activists. They will provide the military advice to the NUG and the BDF, so on and so forth. Especially the Karen National Union and the KIA, Kachin Independence Army. So these are the two biggest EAO that are siding with the people. And you have the some EO and some militia and some border guard force, they are siding with the military. They will support the military coup. And then you also have other EOs that are taking the neutral position. They will never go. They are not siding with neither side. That include UWSA in the China border, and in the Rakhine State near the Bangladesh area, you have the Arakan Army. These are the current situation. We don't know how this conflict will end. Some people think that military will eventually consolidate its power. They will defeat the BDF and the NUG. That's the one theory. Another theory said that where NUG is getting BDF and NUG are getting momentum, and they can somehow defeat the military. And then other people think that Myanmar will be anarchy. It will be the chaotic state because neither side can defeat one another, and Myanmar will be in the ongoing civil conflict for so many years. So you have three different scenarios, and I don't really know how Myanmar will turn out in the future. So that is my first part of the presentation. And the second part, how can international community do? So I mean, there are three ways international community can support Myanmar ongoing crisis. One is the diplomatic pressure. Western governments are imposing targeted sanctions on Myanmar military. ASEAN is calling for policy dialogue between the NAD government and the military council. But China and Russia are kind of like backing the junta. Russia is selling the weapons. China is providing diplomatic backing in UN. So I think international community, especially the West, they should put pressure on the military council. At the same time, they should try to convince the China and Russia to be on board. To put the strong message, to send a strong message to the military that they have to stop the violence. They have to go back to the democracy. That would be the first strategy. Another is to provide humanitarian aid. COVID is really bad. We recently have that wave of COVID. Thousands of people died. Myanmar is one of the poorest countries in the world. Many doctors and nurses and healthcare workers they left the government job and they are joining the civil disobedience movement. So healthcare system almost collapsed. So I think international community should provide humanitarian aid for the poor, for the healthcare assistance, for COVID vaccine, that kind of stuff. And then finally, engagement with the military. I think my last part would be the controversial issue, because political activists from Myanmar think that the international community should not engage with the military at all. I think that's not a good idea. I think in the long run, not right now, but eventually in the long run, I think we should start to engage with the Myanmar military, because the Myanmar military have only a few friends. They are friends of Russia. They are friends of China. So you have a lot of military officers who are trained in Russia. They will come back with the authoritarian mindsets. They will try to impose the authoritarian rules in Myanmar. I think that is really dangerous for the country like Myanmar, that is going under the democratic transition. I think international community should engage with the Myanmar military. They will try to convince the junta and the military officer, to return to the democracy. Started providing training on the leadership, introducing the military officer in Myanmar about democracy. So three strategy that international community can do right now. They should put strong diplomatic pressure, and then second, humanitarian aid, and then in the long run, to start to engage with the Myanmar military. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very concise and to the point, and I'm sure we'll get back to you on various issues, including that of refugees and migrants. Our last presenter of the day is Irene Poetranto, who is a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Toronto. Irene is also senior researcher for the Citizen Lab, and the Citizen Lab being internationally recognized research lab on digital technology and human rights, located at the Monk School at the University of Toronto. The Citizens Lab has consistently exposed the use of technical means by authoritarian governments to attempt to control, survey its populations, and so on, and stays at the forefront of that, if you will, those efforts. In conclusion, I would have to mention, though, that Irene's first degree was in political science here at UBC. So with that plug for the home institution, you're on, Irene.
Thank you very much, Professor Joe, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, DSF Group, for convening this event today, and to esteemed panelists and attendees. So I have a few slides that I will show, and I will discuss about emerging trends on, I suppose, internet controls in Asia Pacific and its impact on civil society. Next slide, please, Kirsty. Thank you. So I thought I would focus my remarks today on two interrelated trends, but first I'll give a little bit of a background. So Asia Pacific is certainly one of the fastest growing regions in the world when it comes to internet economy and internet penetration more generally. To give an example, the Southeast Asian region has minted at least 19 unicorns in 2021 alone. So unicorns are companies rather that are valued at $1 billion or more. In contrast, foreign investments in China in the tech sector has been lagging, particularly since more recently the government has cracked down on the larger tech companies there in China. With this growing internet penetration, and since COVID, we realize how important internet connectivity is for education, for jobs. Governments are increasingly viewing the internet from a securitized standpoint, in that it is increasingly seen as a weapon or as a delivery systems for attack that can jeopardize economic prosperity and national security more broadly. And as a result, different governments around the world, and certainly those in the Asia Pacific region, has sought to secure it through various means, including the two that I mentioned here in my slides, by blocking or filtering certain content online that are viewed as objectionable. And we can go into this more in the discussion section. Certainly different countries view different content as objectionable. For example, Vietnam is particularly harsh on any content that is deemed to be anti-state, whereas Indonesia has tried and not very successful in trying to stamp out its internet of pornography writ large, which has also impacted websites containing LGBTIQ content and sexual reproductive health, for example. A second concerning trend is the use of network shutdowns, and I've put the definition here on the slide. So network shutdowns is generally defined as the deliberate, significant disruption of entire channels of electronic communication within a given geographical area and or affecting a predetermined group of citizens. And this term is used in the literature more broadly to include things like social media bans, suspension of fixed and mobile telephone services, bandwidth slowdowns or throttling, or complete blackouts of internet connectivity. Next slide, please, Kirsty. So just to illustrate, this is data that I compiled from Access Now, which is a digital rights advocacy group based in the US. They released a series of reports called Keep It On, documenting internet shutdowns around the world. And looking at the Asia Pacific region, we see a number of shutdowns here. And generally speaking, up until COVID began in 2020, the trend of internet shutdowns have increased from year to year. And what is notable, as you will see in the slide here, is that countries of all stripes, whether it's democracies or authoritarians alike, have instituted internet shutdowns. India, as the world's largest democracy, up until last year, certainly conducted the most internet shutdown in the world. And in Myanmar, when the government shut down the internet in Rakhine and Chin states, which as a result, many people there were not aware of the unfolding COVID-19 pandemic. That shutdown order was implemented during the time of the civilian government. And when the military coup happened and basically the shutdowns continue in various parts of the country, although they did lift the world's longest internet shutdown that up until the coup took place had been in place in Rakhine and Chin states. And I should also note that the shutdowns were implemented in Rakhine and Chin states coincided with an escalation of conflict between the government and the Arakan army in particular, and I'm happy to go into more detail in the discussion section. Next slide, please, Kirsty. So I will end by saying that, so why do these trends matter, right? And as I've mentioned, I think we need to be concerned with the fact that democracies and authoritarian governments alike are increasingly incorporating internet controls into their toolkit, basically, to respond to security threats, whether real or perceived, because we know from the previous slides that governments have also shut down the internet for banal reasons such as exams, for example, in addition to things like security threats such as protests in the case of Indonesia's Papua or ethnic conflict in the case of Myanmar. Another significant thing to note is that although we typically think of governments as the ones who are issuing these orders to control the internet, whether that's filtering or blocking the internet or shutting down the internet, I think it is important to keep in mind that at the end of the day, it is corporations, private sector actors who are responsible for implementing the order, whether that's Facebook when it comes to content takedown of objectionable content, quote unquote, or whether that's a shutdown order, such as the one that was implemented in Rakhine and Chin State, or nightly in the case of Yangon in post-coup. And therefore, when we think of security threats, we need to also keep in mind telecommunications providers. They are more than just economic actors in this digital age that we live in. They also serve as gatekeepers among other actors of freedom of expression, and therefore, like governments, private firms have become sources of threats to our civil liberties. So I'll end my remarks there. Next slide, maybe. Thank you.
Thanks for the nod to the cat. And Irene, we'll get back to you on some of the issues that you've raised. The floor is open. Those of you who are participants can put questions in the Q&A column, which will appear on my right, and as they come up, and if and as they come up, I'll put them into the discussion. One of the issues that has been touched upon, and I thought I'd go back to it, is the tension involving control of population movements with regard to COVID. Is it legitimate for the Chinese government to, in fact, declare complete lockdowns? And many health authorities would look at that and say this has been arguably the state that has most effectively controlled COVID. And yet we hear from Sarah and Isabelle that this has created enormous tensions or problems with regard to internal movement. How do you look to see a balance there on that question? Isabelle or Sarah? Or
Isabelle, I see to you first.
Sure. Well, it's challenging, isn't it? So there's definitely the question you've raised initially after my my quick talk, Brian, talked about the manipulation of COVID in order to restrict political freedom and political rights. And I think that's, there's definitely been an instrumentalization of it, of a generalized health threat and threat of pandemic to cut corners and make it harder for political dissidents to mobilize, made it harder for freedom of expression, so for voices that were going in different directions as that of the, you know, the political leaders, also made it more difficult for people to move freely as they were used to. So there were definitely several political freedoms have been curtailed following that. In regards to China, what China has done, they were in a very unique position, a very critical position, being the first kind of the epicenter. I think the world, the eyes of the world were on them. And so had they not acted, they would have been criticized and people would have said, you know, we are now faced with a worldwide pandemic because of you. If they act too strenuously, they will also be criticized in the eyes of the world, you know, by the worldwide community by saying, look at the abuse that are happening in the People's Republic of China. So I think that the steps they have taken have proven fairly necessary. Some studies have been done that have shown that to a certain degree, some of the steps have delayed or postponed some of the rates of transmission, early rates of transmission. So it looks like it's been helpful. Otherwise, other studies have also shown that social distancing, limiting the number of contacts was as necessary as, you know, putting essentially a lockdown on Wuhan. So it looks like it was several of those policies were needed, although you know, hindsight 2020 is always difficult to see what was necessary, what was perhaps going more than or abusing this.
No, I didn't mean to be provocative. I think your word instrumentalized is a very good one. For instance, looking at how government has used COVID restrictions to prevent demonstrations, for instance, saying that, you know, they don't violate the political, regulations or those, they violate COVID regulations. So we can put you in jail for, you know, being too not socially distancing, for instance. That I think is the issue. Sarah, you have.
Can I say something about the how governments are using the COVID, you know, to control the in Myanmar? I can share my own experience. During election, you know, the election, we have officially we have only two months of the campaign period. So during that campaign period, you have to campaign for the election. But what happens is that campaign period, you have a COVID second wave coming, and then you have the campaign period. They are overlapping. So what the Myanmar government at the time, it was the Aung San Suu Kyi government. What they did is that they use the, you know, COVID-19 restriction to kind of like you know, to cancel the campaign in the Yangon and other major cities. The point is that the government can use the COVID-19 restriction to oppress the ruling to oppress the opposition party in the election. At least that is what happened in Myanmar during the election.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, and I actually see a question into the chat too, which is great. So what I think about this, what Isabelle is making me think about is in these environments with maybe high economic precarity, the threshold to withstand, you know, further issues of security is really low. So when we think about COVID and migration, and I think it's super interesting how, you know, receiving villages, what we would say is a home village if you are an urban worker, and then you return to your home village, that now you're also a threat to your home safety, because what I'm assuming is also these smaller communities feel like they have a really limited amount of resources that are already being stretched thin. And this is what I've seen as well, as when we have a limited amount of resources, incoming population groups are seen as threats. In Bangladesh, where I do my research, almost I would say the opposite has happened, where Bangladesh relies very heavily on remittances, which in the COVID situation were heavily reduced, right? Because what are these economically precarious jobs in, in Gulf countries in Western Europe and North America? They are the jobs that were, less immediately required in the shutdown, or perhaps they were the first things, cut, especially if we're thinking about keeping people out of our houses, lowering construction sites, things like this. So that serves to, continue to heighten this precarity, which is almost, putting people in a pressure cooker situation. There's not much bandwidth, I would say, to navigate, which is these people are very precarious, I would say. Yeah. And I think a lot of these issues are overlapping and intersecting with one another, and that's when they become, quite tense and areas of political contestation, because there is perhaps no other way for groups to, maneuver themselves.
We've got a question in the chat, and I think that the answers that we just got from the three of you basically answer it. And it says, my question pertains to the role of local politicians who may invoke sub-state nationalism and the pandemic to further their political goals, eventually leading to restricted internal movements. And then, do you see this phenomenon prominent enough for further research? I would take it that all of you would say yes, and in fact, some of you are already doing so. I threatened, Sarah, that I would get back to you to speak a bit more about your research on urban climates, or urban climate situations, and particularly your work on Dhaka.
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, the way that my research understands urban expansion and densification in Dhaka, which is seen to be required for urban development and urban growth, and is in fact like a large part of the Dhaka economy, but also the Bangladeshi economy, as Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh. What happens is I think that we have this game of what is illegal encroachment on what should be environmentally protected land. And so informal settlements would say, no, the government encroaches on canals and by allowing corporate actors to build on illegal land. And the government says, no, people who are building informal settlements and are living in informal settlements, they are the illegal encroachers. So there's this competition, I think, as to who belongs or deserves to settle on land and development. And of course, these are two groups with very different political, economic, but also, military capacities. And what happens in a lot of these informal settlements is that they become cleared. They're marked as illegal. They're not formally evicted because there is a lot of political capital that these informal settlements communities hold, and a very strong ability to protest, and they have done this in Dhaka for a long amount of time. But what will happen instead is that their land is set on fire, or their houses or settlements are set on fire, and then they're cleared, and then it's a very unique opportunity for this land to be redeveloped. Well, there's no one on this land, so now it becomes redeveloped. And this is a pretty clear pattern happening across Dhaka. And what happens is this land is very environmentally precarious, but it's very highly in demand. And when more and more land becomes developed in Dhaka, the effects of this precarity gets shifted and perhaps diffused, like the water literally flows, where land is lower. And that continues this cycle of settlements being, more and more precarious while being marked illegal and, constantly under the threat of eviction and displacement. Yeah, I hope that speaks to your question. I'm happy to.
Thank you. I guess I'll put a question to all of our panelists, which is, how effective do you see respective countries, picking one or others, how effective do you see them dealing with the immediacy of effects of climate change? And this can start with whomever wants to lead. Isabelle, I'll choose you.
Let me think about this one a little bit, Brian.
Okay. Someone else? Nayang, in Burma, in Myanmar, is climate change perceived as an important issue? Is it seen on the agenda of the government in any particular way? Does civil society relate to the notion of climate change? I mean, we're coming up to the meeting in November of the Paris group, but to be blunt, is that immediacy that we take to that, is that essentially something that is just beyond the capacity of either governments or civil societies to cope with at the moment?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Myanmar is one of, if you look at the ranking, you know,
Yeah.
the most environmentally embedded country. Myanmar is always on the top, you know, the first place, second place, so on and so forth. But in local politics, we have other more important the priorities. You have the economic problem. You have the military coup. Before that, civil conflict, democracy, democratic transition, media freedoms. So Myanmar has more immediate, more other pressing issue. So people don't really pay attention to the climate change. Although we understand that you know, Myanmar has a frequent cyclone, flooding is every year, flooding is happening every year, so on and so forth. But one interesting thing is that CSO, local civil society organization, are pushing the government to use more renewable energy. But again, the junta and then, you know, even the previous government, they are seeing the CSO not as a friend. They think CSO are making their life more difficult. You know, they are seeing the CSO as an enemy. So when CSO started talking about not only the democracy, press freedom, but when they are talking about the environmental issue, the government has kind of like annoying, you know. So yeah, just look at the energy issue. Myanmar government is willing to use the coal over other renewable energy, other hydro, you know, other issue. Even for the hydro issue, hydropower, that's again political issue in Myanmar. If you go to the north in the Misong Dam, you know, the major infrastructure project between the China and Myanmar, again that became the big political issue. So yeah, so you have other more important issue in Myanmar.
Thank you. I mean, that's a lead into to the rest of you, the extent to which climate change just simply isn't on the local or national agenda. Is it in Bangladesh, Sarah?
I would say it's hugely on the agenda in Bangladesh. But I would also say there's quite a bit of fatigue at the local level, not necessarily by the government, but by other actors, especially around this topic of climate migration. I think that Bangladesh is very well known for having climate migrants and being told that it's a climate migrant country. And the last study done on this was in 2008, I believe, but only 20% of migrants to Dhaka, which is 500,000 a year, it's a very large number, said so. I mean, this is still, you know, 100,000 people a year. I'm testing myself on math here, but said that they were migrating because of climate reasons, the majority of which say that they're migrating for economic reasons. But when we actually look at, okay, what are these economic reasons, right? Okay, the inability for agricultural livelihoods, for people to sustain themselves. You know, climate change is also a part of this picture. I would say that there is, however, a big fatigue around people coming to do research on understanding climate migration in Dhaka. What I found to be more interesting is the way in which that these insecurities kind of reproduce themselves once you're at the urban level. But the government is extremely engaged on this topic. The issue is like every country, is it's balancing, you know, economic development imperatives with environmental security at all times. And you know, we have these flashpoints, these crisis points, and upon which, you know, making decisions making decisions for an economic, you know, continuing along a trajectory, you know, becomes less pertinent because you have a humanitarian crisis at some point. So that's kind of constantly the tension. And then, and as I mentioned before, you know, in terms of Bangladesh hosting the Rohingya refugees, is there's not actually very much of a climate agenda for these extremely vulnerable populations, and the state has gotten increasingly restrictive around allowing for intervention in this area because of the, you know, the wish to continue with repatriation. So that's a huge tension in an area. I think, you know, the most precarious people in that region will continue to be affected by this, and that's a group that, you know, who is governing that is a very good question.
Right. No, I raised it because as we look toward November, one of the key issues is going to be inequality and how one deals with then the needs, the demands of impoverished populations that really have no effective capacity to mitigate climate change on their own. And are they and can they receive any form of amelioration from those that are wealthy and presumably are the major polluters, and presumably those that could afford to address it. So I just put it out onto the agenda. Irene, I'm going to get back to you if you don't mind. Much of the discussion we see in North America, in fact, in North America and in Europe, is the notion that there's a responsibility for those who operate social media platforms to patrol or regulate content, especially as that content is seen as insightful for hate or insightful for activities, extremist activities. When you look at countries in Asia, one sees that social media and the inflammation of emotions caused through social media has really fueled crises in various countries, extreme nationalism and so on. One looks to the Rohingya issue as being very much fueled by social media. How do you know, I see the concern that you raised, but how do I come to terms with who's responsible for attempting to control or mitigate what I'll call the negative aspects of social media?
Thank you, Professor Joe. That's an excellent question, and I think we can have an entire webinar just discussing that. Before I answer that question, I want to touch upon briefly your previous question about climate change. I think from my perspective, as someone who's researching the internet controls space, I think for me, you know, when thinking about the topic of climate change, what is concerning is that, you know, when it comes to what I said earlier about government securitizing the internet and people who use the internet, you know, I have done research that has shown that environmental activists who are advocating for climate change are increasingly viewed as threats to the state, particularly those who would call out activities such as illegal logging, corruption, etc. And this is certainly the case in places like Indonesia and the Philippines and Myanmar. You know, these are resource-rich countries. The Citizen Lab did an investigation, for example, after an environmental group, that an environmental group in Myanmar was targeted with malware after they started to ask questions regarding the environment. In places like Indonesia and the Philippines, the threats that are faced by environmental and land rights defenders are multidimensional in that they face both online and offline attacks. So, for example, the activists themselves, as well as their neighbors, parents, family members, would have to contend with physical intimidation, just as they would have to deal with terror messages sent through mobile text messages, WhatsApp messages, and through their Facebook. And, you know, oftentimes their activities online are then used to track them, you know, so that these threat actors can find out where they are to then launch, you know, further threats, attacks, and intimidation. In terms of the issue of, I guess, we can call it content moderation, I would always say that I think we need to fall back on international human rights norms and principles, because I think the beauty of that is, or the benefit of that is that, these norms and principles are universal. And, social media companies, for example, like Facebook, they operate globally, right? So they constantly face these challenges where, in order to continue operating in a country like Myanmar, for example, so let's take the example of Telenor, the Norwegian telecom company that operated in Myanmar. They were asked to do certain things, including block certain websites, shut down the internet. And increasingly, they face international pressure, being a Norwegian company, right? Supposedly rights respecting Scandinavians. What are you doing operating in Myanmar? And you have to do all of these things, censoring the internet, shutting down the internet. And they eventually decided to sell their assets and leave. Right. And so companies, certainly those that operate globally, face these challenges all the time. To operate in a jurisdiction, they must abide by that country's laws. And at the same time, they face international pressure to continue to abide by international norms and principles, human rights norms and principles. So there are for example, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that clearly state the responsibilities of companies operating in these jurisdictions must follow. And I think a crucial way to move forward would be for these companies to be transparent. And I think Telenor tried its best to be transparent as much as they could when they were operating in Myanmar. The same I can't say about Facebook. In Myanmar, Facebook is the internet, right? And that's the same in the Philippines, the same in Indonesia as well. There was a survey that was done by a think tank called Learn Asia, based out of Sri Lanka, who said that out of the people that they surveyed in Indonesia, most would answer, no, I do not use the internet. But then on a different question, they would say, I use Facebook, right? So people can't tell the difference between what is Facebook and, that they think Facebook is the internet, basically, or that's their sole access to news and to get job postings and whatnot. And I think with Facebook, because of the significant influence that they wield, I mean, certainly in the Philippines they do, and we have elections coming up in the Philippines. I think companies like Facebook, as I said, need to be committed to international human rights norms and principles, like the UN guiding principles on human rights, among others. They need to avoid having secretive arrangements with states. They need to release transparency reporting with granular data on what content is removed and why. I believe at this moment, Facebook would release in their transparency reporting content that is removed based on local law, but they do not release the statistics on content removed under their terms of service. And as my presentation suggested, social media platforms have their own terms of service, that we have to tick to be on their platforms. And that becomes another set of laws almost, right? In addition to a country's laws that internet users must abide by. So if there is content that is removed, if our freedom of expression is impacted by their terms of service, then they need to be transparent about this, and they need to release granular data, and they need to allow independent researchers such as myself to have access to their platform so that we can conduct research on the impact of their platform. And Facebook is known to be particularly difficult about this. They have removed access from researchers before from their platforms who wanted to research, for example, the impact of political ads on Facebook. So I think a first step is transparency, and by that I mean meaningful transparency. They need to work with the digital rights organizations and researchers like myself, and they need to commit to human rights. Thank you.
Others of you have things to add to this line of discussion? I saw you nodding, Nayan, when Irene said Facebook is the internet.
Right.
Does it have both positive and negative consequences in Myanmar?
I would say both. You have Facebook brought so many positive things to Myanmar, like the information access to information. Facebook, people got their news from Facebook, and also the job employment opportunity. For example, during the COVID-19, government locked down the cities, So what people do is that they try to sell the stuff online. They try to sell the food online. Online mean the Facebook. So I mean these are really good things. But again, best thing is Facebook create a nationalism. It will create the political tribalism in your, people are living in their own bubble. They will start attacking to another group. That kind of like a better negative consequence. One of the recent military staged the coup is the Facebook. I can see that because, the the politics in Myanmar is so polarized. You have the pro-military Facebook user, you have the pro-Aung San Suu Kyi Facebook user. They are fighting over Facebook all the time. Negative attack, so brutal. So the military would think that they have a strong follower by looking at the how people are reacting on the Facebook. So yeah, so I also have one question for Irene. Do you know that Facebook is cooperating with the ruling party or the government to oppress activists, or not to allow the different opinions from the opposition parties?
Well, we know that Facebook cooperates with everybody. We know that Facebook has a political unit that trains different candidates running for office on how to use Facebook to their maximum advantage. They train the BJP party in India. They train Donald Trump's campaign in the US. And so, I mean, that's what we know about Facebook, that they cooperate with anybody who wants to use their platform. I mean, that is their business model, right? In terms of the Myanmar military, I know that Facebook has released that information that they have taken down accounts belonging to the Tatmadaw, right? But the issue is that there are still Facebook accounts that still promote the military and or sell products that benefit the military that are still getting promoted on Facebook. And so, for example, Burma Campaign has released a campaign basically calling for Facebook to also, it's not enough to just remove networks of accounts that are operated by the Tatmadaw, but they also need to remove other accounts that have anything remotely to do, promoting, glorifying the military, selling products that is affiliated with the military. And I think, certainly more could be done by Facebook in this regard. They need to be more transparent, I think, in terms of, like how do they detect these accounts? How quickly do they take them down and for what reason? And I think Facebook has admitted, right, that in Myanmar, they just did not spend enough resources in the country, and therefore leading to Facebook being used to incite hate speech and genocide. I'm not sure if it has improved since these reports came out, but certainly, as you pointed out, with the coup that has taken place, they need to do more to take down like these networks of fake and real accounts that are glorifying the military and the junta.
Thank you. Anybody else join in? I've got a quite different line of questioning here. It derives from where we were this morning. And if I characterize the discussion that we had on geostrategic concerns and on the political, shall we say, the high-level political dealings among Asia-Pacific countries on what are seen as traditional security threats, one of the concluding comments of participants was that the momentum in the region is being propelled by China, and that basically for some of our participants, the US, the West, was essentially not on a path that was going to effectively counter China's agenda, which they didn't see as necessarily a military one. But I'm curious as to what role do you see China playing in the areas of non-traditional security that you are working on and interested in? I'm sure, Irene, you'll have an answer to this. So I'll start with you.
Sure, I do. And I'm just going to highlight that Sarah and Isabelle said they have questions for me. Uh-oh.
Oh, okay, I didn't see.
In terms of China, I mean, I think China has played a significant role, particularly at the UN, in terms of advocating for their vision of what the future of the internet should look like, which is based on this whole notion of cyber sovereignty, that the government should have, instead of a multi-stakeholder governance of the internet where you have technical communities, academics, and civil society, and private sector obviously involved in governing the internet, China believes, and Russia and members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization believe that it should be the government that has, full sovereign control over the internet and how it's being used by its public. And I think the threat here is that I think a lot of the narrative that they use to advocate for the cyber sovereignty concept is finding resonance among developing countries, including those in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is home to what is called the swing states in internet governance. So these are countries that are still kind of undecided in terms of the model of internet governance that they will adopt moving forward. In Southeast Asia, they include Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. These are also my cases for my dissertation. And I think the real risk here is that we will see a race to the bottom in terms of our freedom of expression online, should this cyber sovereignty vision of the internet espoused by China and Russia find resonance among these developing countries. And so I think in order to mitigate that, democracies, especially the developed ones, really need to have concerted action, and they really need to bring these swing states, and swing states include Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, Brazil, India, right? Like all of the countries where the next billion internet users will come online. It's not going to come from the Netherlands or the UK. It's going to come from all these developing countries. And so there is really a need for democracies like Canada and others, the developed democracies, to be engaging with these swing states to mitigate the influence of China, particularly in terms of the norms, as I said, that they espouse with regard to cyber sovereignty, but also the tools. Although I must say that in terms of the tools for internet censorship and surveillance, what we have seen proliferate in the world today, they are made by Western states. They are not made by China. So for example, we have Finfisher, which is a German company with a subsidiary in the UK. We have NSO Group that manufactures Pegasus, which is an Israeli company. We have NetSweeper, which is a Canadian company based in Waterloo, right? So I think democracies also need to be held accountable for the proliferation of these tools that can be used to silence free expression, just as we also need to hold China accountable.
Thank you. Well, for the rest of you, where does China figure into the context you're working in, and what role does it play as an actor on the transnational concerns? There, China, Bangladesh, is there a...
Yeah, I mean, in South Asia, there's, of course, borders shared with China. So there is, I would say significant relations and engagement. What I'm thinking about in our conversation about COVID is their health diplomacy that they've carried out. And I think they've really increased in Bangladesh in particular, their reputation as perhaps a savior of providing vaccines. Right. That's something that's been a huge facet, I think, of what they've been doing in the past year in terms of non-traditional security, in terms of health security, in terms of environmental stuff. They're, of course, highly engaged in, international networks and various forms of climate agreements. But in the Bangladeshi context, I would say they're perhaps a bit less engaged as a direct development partner in terms of climate infrastructure and things like this. But I would say in terms of influence in the region, especially over the last year, has been huge because of this health outreach. And I don't think that influence can be understated, because I think that there's I think that countries, we still have so much vaccine inequality. And, we'll look back on this, and I think different countries will say, okay, well, who was there for us? Who was sending things, and who is getting third shots, in their country?
Right.
I think that will be something that will be salient for sure in the coming years.
Thank you. Nayan, China is clearly a major actor or force in Myanmar.
Right. Yeah, you're right. So right now, the junta, the military council, they were not listening to any international community. They were just ignored. So they were trying to ignore the international pressure. They were not listening to the ASEAN or to the Western country. They said that I quote. This is the quote from the military leader, one of the military leaders. He said that Myanmar, they were trying to learn to work with only few friends. Only few friends. Who are
Yes.
Myanmar? Who are Myanmar? Only few friends. China and Russia, clearly. So I think the military were listening to China. I think because China has so much power in Myanmar. So we know that China is not happy with the current coup. We know that the Chinese government has a good relation with the Aung San Suu Kyi government. So the point is that if the international community, the West in particular, if they can try to make some sort of deal with the China to make Myanmar back to the democracy, that would be wonderful. So you need the China involvement in the Myanmar issue.
But are you optimistic?
Look at the ASEAN. I know that China is backing the ASEAN 5-point
Right.
consensus. So yeah, I think you have to go through the maybe ASEAN, but through the other ways. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
In terms of population control, I think most countries are a little concerned to appear too close to the Chinese example. So, it's not perhaps as applicable in terms of demographic policies or migration policies. But if I may, Brian, I wanted to add something on the topic of climate change that you initiated. Sarah mentioned earlier that, of course, the effect of climate change is different for different populations. But I also wanted to add that it also differs. Some states are more affected by climate change than others. And so if we think about small island states, for instance, like Tuvalu, Kiribati, the Maldives, that sees, literally their state disappearing due to increasing sea level, you can imagine then that they are at the forefront of climate change policies and they want something to happen. Whereas other states, as was once pointed out by Nayang and other panelists, is that, well, economic imperatives are perhaps more front and center in their general priorities. If I may, I wanted to ask one of my several questions to Irene. I think your work is fascinating, so I apologize for always having questions about what you do, Irene. But you mentioned something about like a race to the bottom, and I was wondering if perhaps in that strange respect, COVID could have been an opportunity for more transparency, fewer shutdown, in the sense that I can imagine scenarios where governments need to have information spread to as many people as possible. They need to say, please restrict, please do not go home for this religious holiday. Please limit your travel. These are the places where you can get the vaccines. Important information of that aspect. Could that perhaps have made some states less likely to adopt internet shutdown or restrict websites? This is me perhaps being naive, but I wanted to see if you have seen something, because I've noticed that your table, you covered 2020, 2021. So have you noticed any new reasons for adopting a shutdown, or is it just the same old as before? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isabelle. Great question. And I'm always happy to answer questions for you anytime. I think, I guess I wish I shared that optimism. I think instead what we are seeing with COVID, governments are increasingly being restrictive through other means, including by launching various tools in the name of combating COVID. So for example, contact tracing apps, quarantine geofencing apps, right, to make sure that people who are suspected of having COVID or under quarantine stay within a particular area. We're seeing these measures being instituted in combination with, and I believe this was covered this morning, things like movement control orders, right? And the issue is that I think the decrease in shutdowns, for example, is I don't think it's out of the goodness out of states' heart. I think it's because we are not seeing as many mobilizations, right? We're not seeing people take to the streets, and therefore there's lack of justification, I suppose, for governments to shut down the internet, because typically these shutdowns are instituted in the name of responding to whether that's protests or armed conflict, right? In the Philippines, for example, although the Philippines have never shut down the internet, there were people protesting the recently passed anti-terrorism laws, including, I believe, LGBT individuals, and they were arrested, right? So in that case, if governments, because of COVID-19, facilitating the implementation of emergency measures to prevent people from mobilizing, then governments can just arrest people for violating those movement orders without having to resort to internet-based controls like shutdowns, right? So I think it's in lieu of, as opposed to, no rights violations that are taking place. And I think the concern is that with these new tools that I've mentioned, such as contact tracing app, right? So for example, Singapore created a contact tracing app called Trace Together. And at the beginning, they were very adamant that we're only going to use this app for contact tracing. And then lo and behold, it turns out that it came out that law enforcement officials had access to the data all along, and that some of the data collected had been used for criminal investigations. Indonesia launched a contact tracing app, and at the Citizen Lab, we looked into Indonesia's contact tracing app called Peduli Lindungi, and the Philippines' contact tracing app called Stay Safe. We found multiple security and privacy vulnerabilities with the apps, because they were launched so quickly that there were no, privacy impact assessment, human rights impact assessment, right? Not to mention the fact all the intersectionality issues, things like, well, people who are vulnerable to COVID tend to be older, and older people tend to not have smartphones. So is it really effective for governments to rely on, apps that require people to have smartphones with Bluetooth functionality, right? So effectiveness issues aside, there are serious privacy and security vulnerabilities with these apps. In the Indonesian app in particular, we found functionalities embedded in the app that were not disclosed in the privacy policy, right? And then more broadly, I think the concern is mission creep. So now I believe the Indonesian government has announced that their contact tracing app is going to morph into a digital payment app, which is just super confusing to me, because it has all your vaccine information and all of that. Is that relevant for a digital payment app? And then, so mission creep is a huge issue. And then finally, without a sunset clause, right? Like, when is the government going to stop collecting data without an expiration date of when these apps will cease to be used? Is it when COVID is declared to no longer be a pandemic? When is it, right? The issue is that these apps that are launched in the name of combating COVID will serve as new vectors for human rights violations. So I'm sorry I don't have an optimistic response, but that's what I've seen in my research so far.
Okay, I'm going to have to move here quickly. Sarah, you said you had a question for Irene as well. If you can phrase it succinctly and we get a succinct answer, then we'll move to the sort of final sound bites.
All right, my question, I can make it more simple. How did the hearings on Facebook and transparency in their research, how does this translate to your cases? Does it have a role? Is it only within the US, or is there, a transnational impact potentially?
Facebook recently announced it's potentially going to change its name. So I guess it's hoping that would solve its problems. And I think we need to be careful not to rely on one whistleblower, right? I mean, at the end of the day, will it significantly change Facebook's business model? I don't think so. And fundamentally, as Nayan has pointed out earlier, Facebook's algorithm and the fact that it favors virality, that it favors hate speech, these are the types of content that tend to get bumped up in people's news feed, right? Without fundamental changes to Facebook's business model and its algorithms, I don't think, unfortunately, once again, I'm sorry for being so pessimistic, but I don't think it's going to fundamentally address the issues that we know exist with the platform.
Thank you. So we come to, as I said, final sound bites, and I'll put the final sound bite question to you as follows. We had this far-ranging discussion about transnational security threats, non-traditional security threats in Asia Pacific, which touched on a whole variety of issues and focused, interestingly, on the technological questions, among others. But you are asked in this soundbite to say, what do you regard as a priority for the Canadian government in responding to transnational security, non-traditional security issues in Asia Pacific? What should be a priority? Yes, right, I can see people already wondering. I'm going to go in the order that you spoke. So Sarah, that puts you on the spot.
I would say for the Canadian government and their work in the Asia Pacific region would be to invest and to engage in systemic and comprehensive climate action. That also requires looking inward in the ways in which that their external corporate endeavors impacts other climate sensitive regions. Okay,
Isabelle?
Sure. Population policies, restrictions on population movement, such as lockdowns or limits on interprovincial migration, can be perhaps more successfully implemented if they are well communicated, if they're well planned, and if they're well organized. And so not something that's done spur of the moment with zero planning and very little communication. This is a recipe for...
I'm not sure I would recommend the Canadian situation as being well planned and well coordinated in providing advice, but I take your point, certainly. Nayang, I don't expect you to respond for the Canadian government, but if you look to external actors in general, what would you say should be their key focus or a key focus in thinking about and acting regarding Myanmar?
Yeah, I mean, my message to the Canadian government or international community, please don't give up on Myanmar, please. I know that the current situation is really hopeless. I know that the international community, they have other more pressing issue, like maybe in Taliban, Afghanistan, and climate change, so on and so forth. But I think we should stay have hope in Myanmar. Myanmar is still in the democratic transition period. We are not going back to the authoritarian rule. So if we all work together, if we all help Myanmar to be back to democracy, that would be good. So what you can do is that provide the humanitarian aid, and then especially to the Canadian government. Right now in Myanmar, students are boycotting the education system. We have the most of the majority of the university in Myanmar are public university controlled by the government.
Yeah.
So students are not going back to school. They are boycotting the education system.
Oh.
So I would like to see the Canadian government to offer education to them, like providing the scholarship. For example, at UBC, they are doing like an online course to the Myanmar student. That is really wonderful. So humanitarian aid, scholarship, education to the Myanmar student, because they will become the new generation of Myanmar leaders in the future. So
Thank you.
Please do that.
And Irene, your final soundbite.
Thank you, Professor Job. So I think my remarks today have focused on the shrinking space for civil society and for the promotion and protection of human rights in the Asia Pacific. So I think this is a particularly important area for the Canadian government to engage in, working together with other democracies, developed democracies, to continue to provide assistance, whether that's funding, networking opportunities, and other opportunities for transnational advocacy to continue in light of this shrinking space in the Asia Pacific.
Thank you. And thank you to all of you for participating. I expected that our discussion would range across a whole spectrum of concerns and issues, and not necessarily be able to answer any of the really larger questions that we just ended up exploring. But I'm sure that we have exposed viewpoints and drawn attention to specific concerns. And thank you for your time and your articulate presentations. I'd like at this point to thank Kirsty for her assistance on the technical and the communications side, and also to Emma Fingler. It is just such a pleasure to be able to go into a webinar as a participant or as a moderator and know that the technical issues are going to be solved by someone else. And so with that, thanks to all of you. Thanks particularly to you, Kirsty, and look forward to the opportunity of engaging with you on future events. Thank you and goodbye.